at the onset, just wave at me if there is a problem. And you will see a toolbar on this screen. So just hopefully we can all get past that. It's the best way to view the video. So with that.
May 2016. Voters in the Philippines.
I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully fulfill my duties as President of the Philippines, so help me God.
In May 2016, voters in the Philippines, fed up with a stagnant political system, opted for an unconventional candidate.
We love Duterte so much.
Rodrigo Duterte has bragged about murdering addicts and joked about raping detainees, and remains more popular than ever.
Either you kill me or I will kill you, idiots. Huwag ninyo akong bulahin dito.
So you killed before?
Yes, 3 men.
Great Decisions examines Duterte's bloody crackdown on drug users and investigates how he has upended politics as usual throughout Southeast Asia. The Will of the People, Duterte's Philippines, next on Great Decisions.
Great Decisions is produced by the Foreign Policy Association in association with Thomson Reuters. Funding for Great Decisions is provided by PricewaterhouseCoopers LLP and the Nelson B. Delavan Foundation.
The legend goes something like this. One night, in a bar in Davao City, on the southern island of Mindanao, a tourist lit up a cigarette in defiance of an anti-smoking ordinance. The bar owner summoned the mayor, who pointed a snub-nosed .38 revolver at the man and forced him to swallow the cigarette butt.
I know that story. I would believe it. I've never met Duterte, but from the other stories I've heard, and that he got on his motorcycle and drove down and took his pistol and put it in the private area of a guy, I can believe that.
President Duterte is a very good storyteller, and Filipinos love to listen to his stories. It's always, this tough guy who's often underestimated and basically teaching people a lesson.
He had already a kind of a notorious reputation. He certainly was viewed as sort of a character.
Ngayon, kung ako ang nidemanda niyong patayan, i-demanda ninyo ako, patayin ko rin kayo.
One of my predecessors, Ambassador Frank Wisner, apparently rode up part of the Philippine Peninsula with Duterte on motorbicycles. At the beginning, he looked at me and he challenged me and said he bet I wouldn't do it. And I said, oh, yes, I would. I think it produced nervous prostration among my security detail, who couldn't quite imagine the American ambassador riding through the streets of Davao on a motorcycle, but that's exactly what happened.
Duterte's unique approach to justice won over voters in Davao City, which had one of the highest murder rates in the Philippines. He has dominated the city's politics since 1988.
You have to look at it from the Filipino point of view. What made Duterte popular in Davao, in the northern part of Mindanao, is he made his city clean and safe. And many cities in the Philippines are the opposite.
Duterte obviously was watching very carefully both what the communists were doing, which was assassinating policemen on the streets of Davao, and what the anti-communists were doing. He saw that there was like a total breakdown of law and order in Davao, and he basically said, I will restore law and order. And that entailed some of the very muscular tactics that we saw.
In the 2016 presidential election, Duterte pledged to bring his controversial methods to the nation as a whole. The sitting president likened him to Adolf Hitler, but he defeated a split field with 39% of the vote.
As of 9:36 ngayong gabi, 67% na po ng mga clustered precinct. Number 1 pa rin si Duterte at pumapangalawa si Po.
You had two distinct things going on. One, a populist candidate who appealed to people who were tired of the inherited wealthy ruling the country and from their perspective not doing much for them. And then the two well-known candidates split the vote.
I had young entrepreneur friends in Manila who I was talking to shortly after the election. I was a little surprised that they would have voted for President Duterte. And they said, we're sick of crime, traffic. We sit in traffic for hours every day. And he's going to come in and fix that.
I've been an observant of many presidents from the time of Marcos up to the current situation. I've never seen one that has that kind of following and people who are actually looking at him as the leader that they've been waiting for.
Duterte appealed to Filipinos who were fed up with a democratic system that bred corruption and seemed to advantage only entrenched elites.
He comes from sort of the provincial elite that has always felt resentment against the Manila-based elites. He's always ranted against what he calls Manila imperialism.
There's a long history of corruption, and a very small elite were the principal beneficiaries of that. Those elite figures often were the ones who got the major political jobs as well.
What I see is frustration with democracy around the world is not producing the results that give you laws by and for the people. We are facing that in the United States with the corruption of our constitutional system, with gerrymandering, voter suppression, and dark money, and particularly the billionaire Citizens United money that is corrupting our political process.
Duterte also appealed to Filipinos who were frustrated with their country's international relationships, including with the United States.
You'll see love-hate relationships, understandably so, in any place that there was a colonial power. And the United States was the colonial power.
We went to war in the Philippines in the end of the 19th century and displaced Spain as the colonial power. We restored in the 1930s autonomy to the Philippines, but we retained the use of certain sensitive and critical military facilities. But with the 90s, the bases came up for renegotiation, and the politics of the Philippines had changed, and as a result, the United States had to withdraw from the bases it had in the Philippines.
In a country where many citizens perceived crime and drug use to be out of control, Duterte's promise to restore order resonated. According to official police statistics, more than 5,000 people have died in the crackdown since he took office. Activists say the real figure is more than twice that high.
Sana man po mga innocent tao, huwag naman po nilang idadamay dyan sa mga bagay na yan. Lalo na po dito sana po. Hindi po yan kahit na anong drug, umiinom lang po yan.
We were headed to a summit in Laos, the East Asia Summit, and we were going to have our first bilateral meeting with Duterte. And it came out that he called Obama a son of a whore.
I do not have any master except the Filipino people. Nobody but nobody. You must be respectful. Do not just throw away questions and statements. Putang ina, mumurahin kita dyan sa forum na yan.
And we canceled the meeting. The reason Duterte called Obama this is that we were being critical of his extrajudicial killing of people in his anti-drug campaign. And Duterte was saying, I refuse the legitimacy of your ability to criticize us.
The extrajudicial killings are accusations that were made by many human rights groups. And like in any war, there is collateral damage, so to speak, especially in the beginning of the drug war. Many of these killings were actually perpetrated by those policemen who were themselves involved in drugs.
Duterte was very successful in making Filipinos believe that drugs and crime are an existential threat.
The conflicts rending Philippine society apart go beyond the drug war. In the South, Duterte has inherited a long, smoldering confrontation with Muslim separatist groups, including several affiliated with the so-called Islamic State.
As Mindanao filled up with immigrants from other parts of the Philippines, generally Christian, there was a reaction from the native peoples of Mindanao and the beginning of dissidence on the part of Muslim Mindanaos. That led to a long period of struggle, fighting.
In the South, you had Muslim separatist groups who felt that they should not be part of the Philippines, that they should have been part of Malaysia or Indonesia. If you look at the maps, that they were victims of colonial mapping.
It's been there for 1,000 years. It's been a problem that we've had for so many, many years. And President Duterte has been offering a peace pipe. And so very recently, we passed the Bansang Moro Law, which is basically giving them some autonomy.
Duterte has threatened to allow the death squads currently targeting drug users to go after leftists as well.
Duterte himself actually got communist support for his election. But then the communists broke with him and then started attacking the military, and their supporters in the city started doing demonstrations and attacking Duterte. And now the president has gone after them.
I don't think the Philippines is ready to become a socialist country. We want to remain a democratic country, free enterprise. I think the government is doing what it can to be able to pacify many of these groups that have been advocating for the overthrow of the government.
In this election, I commit to the Filipino people that this will be a clean election. Ako yung
As Duterte remakes Philippine society, he consistently flouts existing democratic norms. He has been especially hostile to journalists who are critical of his administration.
Duterte said if police take a gift or graft, it's not a crime. I think that's a crime in everybody's constitution. Whether it's enforced is a different story. So that's a major flouting of democratic norms.
Some say this is brought in by the Chinese traders in the past. They always say that in Asia, that whenever you deal with authority, you give something to make things work faster. That's corruption here in the West. But in the Philippines or in Asia, that's a normal thing that happens. You give a gift to a government official because he's doing his job well. But here, that's corruption.
Filipinos are angry about corruption. And President Duterte himself has said he'll go against corrupt officials because he knows this is a concern. I don't think there are separate norms. I think that there are ways that officials everywhere justify corruption in the same way.
Yet there have been tentative victories for the rule of law. In a landmark case in November 2018, 3 police officers were convicted of murdering a civilian, the first such ruling to emerge from Duterte's drug war.
They arrested the people who fired the guns, but where were the police commanders who were above them and who should take responsibility for ordering these policemen to do what they did? Have they been punished? No. They've been promoted? Some of them, yes.
Our government hears loud and clear what human rights activists and human rights organizations are saying. And so we've been able to manage that a little bit much better now. The law enforcement agencies have become more aware of the issues involved around it. And then, in fact, a number of policemen have been already removed from the force. At the same time, we've also charged them in court. I think something like 2,000 to 3,000 have already been removed from PNP force. And it's a continuing cleanup process.
Duterte's shakeup goes beyond domestic politics. He has also put his stamp on Philippine foreign policy.
He has had to face this challenging choice that confronts him one way or another almost constantly about how to balance or weigh the importance of 2 very significant relationships, that with China and that with the United States.
I I know that the United States has issues with countries like China and perhaps with Russia too, but we feel that it's time for us to be able to have these relationships that are meaningful, that we can deal with the world on our own. And while we value our relationship with the United States, we also feel that it's time for us to look into the other countries to be able to deal with them.
We've never considered the Filipinos bound in thrall in some manner to the United States, and the Philippines deserves its own and needs its own form of strategic autonomy, where it has strong relations with other nations in Southeast Asia and globally can reach out to China and Russia. So I fully agree. I don't think that one replaces the other.
Eager to reduce the Philippines' dependence on the U.S., Duterte has turned enthusiastically to China.
I announce my separation from the United States.
In terms of South China Sea, Duterte government is not, in the Chinese perception, making trouble with China on the South China Sea. In terms of the overall attitude towards China, Duterte government is also extremely pro-China and regarded as friendly power compared to the previous Aquino III administration. Duterte's effort has also been rewarded by the Chinese generous commitment of financing in the Philippines.
His original goal was to get more foreign assistance from China, both aid and trade. There has been more trade. Unfortunately, it's also come with a large number of Chinese workers who have come into the country, and some of those have been in the middle class professions as well.
Duterte has summed up his goal for the Philippine economy in 3 words: build, build, build. To implement that plan, he must attract investment.
The economy is growing very well, but what's important also is the program that the government has embarked, and this is the infrastructure program. It's a $178 billion infrastructure program, massive, that is going to develop infrastructure from the south all the way to the north. It's now the second fastest growing economy in Asia.
Certainly, China is the major source of a lot of the financing for all of the infrastructure building that's going on in the Philippines, and that Duterte has put out as one of his signature initiatives. That was a lot of the thinking behind his patching things up with China when he came into office as well.
If we think about the growth of emerging markets as a whole, Philippines has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world, let alone in emerging Asia. So it's one of the Asian Tiger Cub economies, and you certainly see promising economic activity, agrarian jobs giving way to manufacturing jobs and also giving way to services jobs in a very natural trajectory. The underlying growth dynamics, I think, are very promising, obviously with regard to demographics as well.
Already, some Filipinos are showing signs of frustration that the reorientation to China has not produced dramatic economic benefits.
Traffic, as in Washington, is a terrible hit on the economy. The traffic and congestion, which he has really done nothing about. I know he's looking at plans for subways, for light rails, but he only has a couple of years left in office, and these are 15 to 20-year projects. The average person in New York City might complain about 45 minutes or an hour commute. The person in Manila has a 3-hour commute each way. And that's just average in Metro Manila.
His opening to China was originally seen relatively positively as a way to get more aid from China. But the Chinese have not been very forthcoming with that aid, and so he's lost some credibility.
The Chinese are dragging those disbursements along. So part of the consideration, of course, that, well, the disbursement will also depend on how Duterte government responds to other issues in our bilateral relations. Just want to make sure that the Philippines government will always maintain its pro-China and China-friendly posture, and they will be constantly rewarded.
Despite Duterte's warm relationship with Xi Jinping, China has not been shy about pressing its territorial claims in the South China Sea. Claims which increasingly come at the expense of the Philippines.
I wouldn't say they've softened them at all, but they have put forward a kind of a softer face. They have been touting, in the wake of Duterte's election, diplomatic negotiated settlements, sharing of resource exploitation options, etc. So trying to put forward more of a diplomatic approach as opposed to the sort of legal battles that they were engaged in previously.
China out of Philippine waters! China out of Philippine waters!
The Philippines was very smart and original in taking their cases to the United Nations, which they won. International tribunals, but they don't have a blue water navy that's capable of protecting itself against perceived or real Chinese aggression or against the biggest threat, which is Chinese, Taiwanese, even Japanese fishing boats.
These reefs that were also being dismissed as just rocks by the Obama administration have now turned into military bases. And the Chinese refused to talk to us. They did not recognize the decision made by the UNCLOS, which we brought out The Hague, and where we supposedly won that arbitration. It's like we were left on our own. The United States would not get involved in any territorial dispute, so we had to reach out to China on our own. The only way is to be able to talk to them and find ways and means to be able to what is mutually beneficial for both.
In July 2019, a Chinese vessel rammed a fishing boat in disputed waters in the dead of night, leaving 22 Filipino fishermen clinging to inner tubes in the open sea. Duterte infuriated many Filipinos when he dismissed the assault as just a little maritime incident.
A Chinese fishing boat rammed a Philippine fishing boat, sank it, and left the Filipino fishermen in the water to drown. Fortunately, another boat came by and picked them up. But that has created a very bad feeling towards China.
Duterte has basically said, let's not make an issue out of this. And basically, Filipino officials swooped down on these poor fishermen and told them to just shut up. And that's been very controversial and has caused a lot of worries about Philippine sovereignty and our ability to protect our own oceans and our own marine resources and our own fishermen.
The government was criticized by many people in the Philippines, especially the opposition, that we were very weak in our response. But when President Duterte went to China, they formally apologized and that they were prepared to compensate the fishermen.
In May 2019, Duterte's allies won the Philippine midterm elections, affirming the president's popularity and strengthening his hold on the government.
They did very well. We talk about the Trump effect or the Republican Party being afraid to criticize the president or challenge him because they are afraid they'll be primaried. There were a lot of people, some who were Duterte supporters, many who were not, who jumped on the bandwagon and did very well.
Duterte polled 80% popularity in 2019. He continues to be popular among large sectors of Filipinos. Some people say that people are afraid to speak out, but I would say the popularity is genuine. He's talked about his daughter succeeding him, so this is very classic Filipino again. It's political families instead of political parties or political movements or ideologies that carry on presidential legacies.
Some experts have urged Western countries to scale back military aid that is facilitating Duterte's drug war. Others worry that any cutbacks could drive the Philippines further into the arms of the Chinese.
We cannot allow for extrajudicial killings and still have business as usual. We should reconsider military-to-military connections between the United States and the Philippines. Our objective is to change the behavior in the Philippines and to adhere to international standards in regards to justice.
Oh, for heaven's sakes, it drives me crazy when I hear assertions like that because, we forget we're treaty allies. The fact that the Filipinos give us a privileged treaty position is good for our defense. We're not doing the Philippines a favor. We're doing ourselves a favor. Our ability to operate near, in conjunction with the Philippines is good for America.
Maybe 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, we could stomach certain discomfort with the types of leaders that we engage with. Now, where I think the existential crisis in the world today is about democracy and authoritarianism, we need to be shaping foreign policy that is more rooted in promoting democratic values.
That would unfortunately probably play into the line that Duterte has been putting forward recently, which is that the U.S. is not a reliable ally and that this just shows that we need to be closer to China. So I think that would probably be counterproductive.
Around the world, Duterte is part of a rising cohort of democratically elected leaders who have swept to power on the promise of a new brand of politics, openly contemptuous of existing elites and adept at tapping into a reservoir of popular frustration. Now, as he sets about remaking the Philippines in his own image, pundits can only guess how long his unorthodox style will maintain its appeal.
Great Decisions is a
Okay. Looks like Fred's sharing his screen. Just remember to type your questions into the chat box, and when Fred is ready to take questions, I'll help facilitate that.
Thank you, Susan. And again, good morning, scholars of HASP. You know, I took some notes down during that during the video presentation. And let's remember some of the things that were said during that video. You talked about one point that was made that came up was people in the Philippines being fed up with democracy. The phrase Manila imperialism. Democracy not delivering what the people needed. Being controlled by entrenched elites. The US being the colonial power. When Duterte said that he had no master but the Filipino people. The fact that Obama dismissed reefs as rocks. And on and on. The comment by the one US official that America had to resume promoting democracy around the world, which equaled, from Duterte's perspective, the United States not being a reliable partner, and the fact that his continued support means that people are still openly contemptuous of elites. Now, if it's worth mentioning that people have been openly contemptuous of elites now, we can surmise that once upon a time, people were contemptuous of elites, but they weren't open about it. And now they feel they have the freedom to do so. I mention all those things, those highlights, because they sound in an odd kind of way, very parallel to trends that have been going on around the world. Next, consider this. While that video was running, I put together I was reminded of some comments made by General Douglas MacArthur during his speech before Congress in 1951. Now, this is a very famous picture of Douglas MacArthur wading ashore Leyte Gulf, part of the Philippines, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is him wading ashore. It's a very famous, heroic picture of MacArthur coming to save the Filipino people on October 20th, 1944. MacArthur, many of you know that 2 years earlier, MacArthur had been ordered off the island by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where he went to Australia, a very heroic escape, very MacArthur-esque, if you want to put it like that. Very heroic escape, where he ended up in Australia, and the plan was to begin mounting an effort strategically, tactically, to bring the war against Japan. MacArthur had different ideas. He wanted to take the war back to the Filipino people because before he left, he told them via radio broadcast, "I shall return." When he came back, the first thing he did was grab the radio transmitter and broadcast, people of the Philippines, I have returned. And the Filipino people, up until at least during the time that I was growing up in the Philippines, MacArthur was still very much identified as a hero, maybe not too much of an exaggeration to say, for many of the Filipino people, not all, but many of the Filipino people, the savior of the Philippines, surely the United States had a very good reputation, because after all, the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, like other parts of Asia where the Japanese conquered, had been savage and brutal. But then consider this. In April 1951, during the Korean conflict, General MacArthur is relieved of command by President Truman and comes home to wild acclamation, great response, much affection. He's been gone from the United States for 20 years at least, if not more. He has a long history in the Philippines because his father, Arthur MacArthur, once again proof that some parents hate their children giving them names, but Arthur MacArthur had been part of the occupying force of the US Army during that thing called the Spanish-American War that broke out in 1898 and eventually in the Philippines evolved into something that the Americans called the Filipino Insurrection. The Filipinos referred to it as them trying to get rid of another would-be colonizer, just like they had gotten rid of the Spanish, aided by the Americans who they thought had come to help them gain independence. But when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the Americans proved that all they did for the Filipino people was swap out one colonizer for another. I'll address that in a moment. But to understand the context of what we're dealing with, consider General MacArthur's speech in 1951. It sounds both good and awful at the same time. Bear with me as I read. At one point of the speech, he says, he's talking about the situation in Korea and the problem of communism spreading throughout Asia in general. And then he paused for a second and said, before one may objectively assess the situation now existing there in Asia, we must comprehend something of Asia's past and the revolutionary changes which have marked her course up to the present. He's right. Before we can talk about Duterte today, we must address the revolutionary changes that have marked her course in the present, or that nation's course from the past up to now. Watch this. MacArthur, being both an intellectual scholar as well as a military man, he said, long exploited by the so-called colonial powers of which the United States was one, with little opportunity to achieve any degree of social justice, individual dignity, or a higher standard of life. Translation, for a long time, as one of the colonized peoples of Asia, the Filipinos had had little opportunity for social justice, which means economic opportunity, individual liberty, freedom, decency, individual dignity, or a higher standard of life, such as guided our own noble administration in the Philippines. He referred to the American occupation or control of the Philippines as guided our own noble administration. The peoples of Asia found their opportunity in the war just past, World War II, to throw off the shackles of colonialism and now see the dawn of new opportunity, a heretofore unfelt dignity, and the self-respect of political freedom. People did not have in the Philippines, in Asia, and the Philippines particularly, or at least MacArthur thinks that the Americans gave it to them, but the Filipino people were being denied social justice, individual dignity, a higher standard of living, and political freedom, meaning independence. He went on to say, mustering half of the Earth's population and 60% of its natural resources, these peoples are rapidly consolidating a new force, both moral and material, with which to raise the living standard and erect adaptations of the design of modern progress to their own distinct cultural environments. In other words, they're doing this to recreate modern political development according to their own cultural needs and not those being imposed by colonizers like the United States. Whether one adheres to the concept of colonization or not, this is the direction of Asian progress, and it may not be stopped, and indeed it has not been stopped. It is a corollary to the shift of the world economic frontiers as the whole epicenter of world affairs rotates back toward the area whence it started. In this situation, it becomes vital that our own country, and this is where it gets awful, that our own country orient its policies in consonance with this basic evolutionary condition, rather than pursue a course blind to the reality that the colonial era is now past and the Asian peoples covet the right to shape their own free destiny. What they seek now is friendly guidance, understanding, and support, not imperious direction, the dignity of equality and not the shame of subjugation. Everything MacArthur said in that speech, the undertone of it is that there had been colonization was the shame of subjugation. And he still presumes to think that they are even welcome to accept or welcoming that kind of friendly guidance, understanding, and support. That is still a perspective that presumes that we have something that they automatically are going to want and that they definitely need. Well, that kind of mindset, of course, had its origins, and I'm gonna go through this because I really want to get y'all's questions. If we go back to this event, America's very, very shaky relationship with the Philippines, meaning as a colonizer, began with the sinking of the battleship Maine, 1898. Now, you can see here that in 1898, this political cartoon depicts Spain as being, well, something of an ape-like brute and its rule over Cuba. Let me just move right ahead. There's a real good short video that explains, make sure my sound is turned up. Okay, a real good short video that explains an overview of the Spanish-American War and the relationship of that war to the Filipino people.
America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics. And one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The US joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the US seize Cuba from Spain for itself or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the US should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. But at this point, in 1898, the fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The US would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906, 1917. Each time, the US military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. But today, when Americans think about the US and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think
the American intervention in Cuba and the passage of legislation to not dominate the island like a typical European colonizer, but giving the country, the United States, the right to intervene in Cuba during times of difficulty to maintain law and order. And we cannot possibly underestimate this desire to maintain law, order, stability in the early 20th century, because for the sugar interests and United Fruit Company and other major merchants or agricultural importers, exporters in the early 20th century, particularly when it came to bananas and sugar. You absolutely cannot underestimate the power of what today we would call those two lobbies when it came to the Philippines and Cuba. And so they definitely had a lot of power on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C. And the Cuban and the Filipino people, well, they would end up bearing the brunt of that. So take what that video said about the policies toward Cuba, transfer them to the Philippines. And what you've got then is a situation where by 1898, 1899, by 1900, the Filipino people were thoroughly fed up. The Philippine Insurrection begins in 1899. Now, I'm not going to go through all this on the screen. You can just see here that the Philippines was colonized by Spain, ruled Spain from 1571 to 1898, so a real long time. Let's catch up to 1898. End of July, 1898. The United States had 13,000 volunteers there and 2,000 regulars. So a volunteer army, which we don't have a US Army yet at that point. The Filipinos in July 1898 was still fighting for independence. The US goal, America wanted the Philippines as a territory. The Spanish government, losing the Spanish-American War, was desperate to find what the Spanish government was looking for a way, or Spanish forces were looking for a way to get out of the pickle of fighting the United States. But Spanish military leaders knew that if they simply didn't fight, when they got back to Spain, they would probably be shot. They were right. So what they did was they cut a deal with the United States. The Spanish would offer light resistance in a staged conflict, or let's say a planned conflict, a planned engagement. And on August 13th, 1898, there was a short battle, 17 US soldiers killed, 105 wounded. The Spanish lost like they intended to do anyway. They were able to go back to Spain and say that they had put up the good fight. And then the US occupied Manila. And here's where things begin to get not just a little bit bizarre, but definitely fishy. The United States occupied Manila, the capital, but did not include the Filipinos in the initial occupation. Now, bear with me as I read this. This is from President McKinley. The destruction of the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila by the United States Naval Squadron, commanded by Rear Admiral George Dewey, followed by the reduction of the city and the surrender of the Spanish forces, practically affected the conquest of the Philippine Islands and the suspension of the Spanish sovereignty over them. Translation, the Spanish left their control, we got it. With the signature of the Treaty of Peace between the United States and Spain by their respective plenipotentiaries at Paris on the 10th instant, and as a result of the victories of American arms, the future, watch this closely now, the future control, disposition, and government of the Philippine Islands are ceded to the United States. Listen, the reason why I pointed that stuff out at the beginning of the presentation about Duterte talking about, I have no control, no master but the Filipino people, what Americans need to understand is that in nations like China, the Philippines, even on the African continent, any former nation that was dominated for any length of time by a former colonizer, and to be quite honest, in defense of the United States, America did not occupy or be a colonial master over the Philippines for not nearly as long as the European powers were, for example, the French in Indochina, or the British and the French and the Italians in Africa. But that's kind of besides the point. Colonization in any form, for whatever length of time, brings with it the humiliation people, the robbing of their dignity, and generally speaking, the colonizer is out to economically benefit, which means that the people being colonized will economically suffer. All of the things that Duterte and the Filipino people are pushing back against now, that is those who support him. McKinley went on to say, to fulfill the rights of sovereignty. So look at this language, to fulfill the rights of sovereignty, the rights of sovereignty. So America assumes that it has the right to be a sovereign of another people and the responsible obligations of the government thus assumed. So this is some twisted form of noblesse oblige, where those in power have to look out for those less fortunate, like a lord of the manor who will extend kindness to those working the land. They don't own the land, they work the land. And the Lord is so wonderfully and so kind that they don't kick them off. They assume that you work the land, you live on the land, we We have a relationship. You grow things, you give me a cut, and then my job is to protect you. It's very paternalistic. It's a father, it's a mother-child, father-child, ruler-ruled relationship, not a relationship of equals. So it assumed the rights of sovereignty, obligations of the government thus assume, the actual occupation and administration of the entire group of the Philippine Islands becomes immediately necessary, and the military government heretofore maintained by the US in the city harbor and Bay of Manila is to be extended to the whole of the ceded territory, all of the islands of the Philippine archipelago. And I got to tell you, there are a lot of islands in the Philippine archipelago. You can see here from this panel on the right, the Spanish-American War, also in combination, or to think of one is to necessarily have to invite discussion of the other. The Filipino Insurrection of 1898 to 1901. If we had been paying attention in the early 1960s, we would have seen that there were some pretty suspicious similarities between what happened in the Philippines and what eventually was going on in Vietnam. In performing this duty, the military commander of the US will make known to the Filipinos, in other words, the military commander is going to tell the Filipinos that the authority of the US will secure the persons and property of the people of the islands, and it will be the duty of the commander of the forces of occupation to announce that we come not as invaders. I've come to take over your country, but I'm not invading you. Now, that of course is hard to believe when the Filipinos, so recently having been dominated by the Spanish, are now looking at another would-be conqueror, well, not would-be, but someone that actually conquered them. And they're announcing that they're going to put a military governor in place, not someone democratically elected, not someone elected by the people, but a military governor from the person that has arrived with warships and army to take over their country. Let's keep going. Well, let me back up one. All persons who either by active aid or by honest submission cooperate with the government, if you help us, if you submit to us, you will receive the reward of its support and protection. You play ball with America and our occupying force, we will support you and we will protect you. For an independent people who are seeking to support and defend themselves, that is definitely robbing them of the autonomous direction that they seek to go. Many years later in 1918, when Woodrow Wilson goes to Europe with his 14 points, this point right here, the direction of former colonized people to choose their own destiny, will be one of the major things that he's trying to advance at the Versailles Conference that colonized people in 1918 still want. Now, they're not going to get it, but the mere fact that he brought it up, Woodrow Wilson, who had one of the worst records on race in the early 20th century among American presidents, the mere fact that he's saying that should gather our attention about how important it was in reconstructing a post-World War I world. The president also wanted to say that all others would be, anyone who didn't cooperate with the American military forces will be brought within the lawful rule we have assumed, with firmness if need be, with firmness if need be. You all are very smart and can figure that out, what that means for yourselves, but without severity so far as possible. The military authority, which must remain supreme in the ceded territory, shall provide the municipal laws of the territory in respect to private rights and property, and the repression of crime are to be considered as continuing in force and to be administered by the ordinary tribunals so far as practicable. The United States military is going to become the police force. The United States military and the US government are going to get directly involved in the lives of private citizens and their private property. Can you imagine how American heads would have exploded if the government got involved in determining how people dispose of their private property? We fought a war called the Civil War over a particular kind of peculiar property called slaves, because there's this notion among American Republican ideology, of which led to the book, for at least for one historian, Eric Foner, Free Men, Free Soil, Free Labor. Free men, free soil, free men, free labor, free something. Labor, soil, and men. That a free people have the right to choose their own destiny, and a free people have the right to choose how to dispose of their own property. The Filipino people were being denied that. So we move in there. the Filipino people react? The taxes and duties heretofore payable by the inhabitants to the late government become payable to the US. So now Filipinos, you now will pay your taxes to us, unless it's seen fit to substitute for them other reasonable rates or modes of contribution to the expenses of the government. If private property is taken for military use, it should be paid for when possible in cash. So if we confiscate your material, if we confiscate your private property, I gave a presentation recently on what Stalin did in the 1930s to the Ukrainians, that terrible period called the Holodomor, where Ukrainians had their land, their animals, their farms confiscated because he had this grand idea of establishing farm collectives, another one of the many failures of communism. Now we're telling the Filipino people in an earlier time, we're going to confiscate your private property and use it for military use, and we'll pay you when possible in cash. So I'm gonna take your stuff and pay you and write you an IOU and pay you when I can. If you're a private property owner, how are you feeling about that? If you're a private property owner and you're a Filipino, you just got rid of one colonizer, you now have another, how are you feeling about this particular deal? At fair valuation. And when payment in cash is not practicable, receipts are to be given. All ports and places in the Philippine Islands in the actual possession of the land and naval forces of the US will be open to the commerce of all friendly nations. So let me get this straight. Let me make sure I understand this, America. You kicked out Spain, yes. You now have stepped in to be the colonizer, yes. You are denying my political freedom, yes. You are confiscating my private property, yes. You are now going to trade with other nations, but taking over my ports and my facilities, yes. And you're probably doing that for your economic benefit and not mine, yes. What's the problem? The Filipino people, much like people on the African continent, they have a long memory of this period of colonization and the subjugation. So what I'm getting at is this: Rodrigo Duterte is not necessarily some aberrant product or aberrant result of the current political climate. He is an outgrowth of a long process of historical development, evolution, if you feel like that, that is not only is it the almost predictable result, it's a logical result based on the history of the Philippines with the United States. So when he's saying things and using, look, for the Filipino people and any former colonized people, this, what do we call them, buzzwords, dog whistles, when they use words like imperialism, that means something to them. And let me transfer the conversation for just a moment to leaders on the African continent. When African leaders use the term neo-colonialism, they know that the history of colonialism in their countries, terrible as it was, that is going to, however corrupt and bad and brutal they may be, they use the word neo-colonialism, and all of that resistance and opposition to their corruption, their brutality, it goes away. Because people know that even if they have a bad, corrupt leader, he's still one of theirs, and it's still better than having the former colonizer. Now, is that true? Do African leaders manipulate people by doing that? Of course they do. Is Duterte doing that? Of course he is. And then finally, or we get to close to the end here, furthermore, US rule stipulated that all goods and wares not prohibited for military reasons will be admitted upon payment of such duties. It is look, watch this. You have to love this statement. It is the paramount aim of the military administration to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by assuring them that full measure of individual rights and liberties, by proving that the mission of the United States is one of benevolent assimilation. How do you benevolently assimilate somebody? And then consider this. When they say they want to win the confidence, respect, and affection, this sounds very, very similar to the kind of language that slaveholders used when talking about their blacks. Why would they want to run away from us? We're like family. We're affectionate. I take care of them. They work for me. I treat them well. Why wouldn't they love me? So this is still very much in that mindset of paternalism and expansion and imperialism and supremacy that dominated so much of the domestic and definitely foreign policy of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. And speaking of benevolent assimilation, the assimilation of a people group by absorbing foreign people into a new culture, with the primary stated reason being that it is an act of benevolence. You all know, you've heard me say that the political cartoons very often tell a truth that words just can't. This view of President McKinley smacking a apparently misbehaving Filipino to benevolently assimilate them shows clearly that if the Filipinos had any kind of an inclination to have independent thought, to do something beyond the purview of what the Americans considered acceptable, well, a spanking, probably a military spanking, was in order. As a result of the Treaty of Paris ending the Spanish-American War, the Philippines became a territory of the United States. The Senate had to ratify the treaty. The Filipinos at the same time were moving to establish a republic. They also were preparing to resist the United States' attempts to impose the treaty, that is, exert American authority. Relationships, not unsurprisingly, deteriorated, and on February 4th, 1899, Filipino and American patrols exchanged fire near a disputed village. It was an early spark of what ignited into the Philippine Insurrection. To this day, no one knows who fired the first shot, but either way, the Filipino-American War had begun. As I say, it was called the Filipino Insurrection, and if we were to reframe it, I suppose, into the more accurate title, it would be the Filipino fight for independence. Look, make no mistake about this. This conflict did not last all that long, and the Filipinos definitely lost, but this was a brutal, brutal conflict. Congress authorized volunteers, in other words, the raising of troops for Filipino service. September 1899, US forces arrived and they destroyed and scattered as much of the nationalist army. Now, the nationalists, those who wanted Filipino independence, they used guerrilla warfare. This is where I say that if we've been paying attention, and this is not too much of a stretch, but you know, there are those like General MacArthur, for as paternalistic as he was, and people like General Omar Nelson Bradley, who had been in Asia and had studied warfare enough and knew warfare enough to know that fighting in Asia under any circumstances at any time was going to be different than fighting in Europe. That's why General Omar Nelson Bradley was quoted as having said, fighting a major land war in Asia will be the wrong war at the wrong place at the wrong time. That included Vietnam. That it absolutely included Vietnam. And if somebody had bothered to read the history and connect the dots, there may have been some wisdom that they could have gotten from what happened in the Philippines, trying to fight a major land war or suppress a people bent on independence when you have an army stationed thousands of miles away. As it turned out, 1899 is different than 1965, 66, 67, 68. I get it. But there was still something to be learned about getting involved in a conflict that in many ways resembled so much of what our forces experienced in Vietnam. The terrain, rice paddies, mountains, jungles, rough trails, primitive roads. The nationalists waged the war in ambushes, raids, and surprise attacks. Again, sounding very similar to Viet Cong tactics. They also disguised themselves as non-combatants, blended in with the civilians. The overall goal, achieve, I know that there's a misspelled word there, achieve political versus military victory by, look at this. Their goal wasn't to, their goal was not to deliver a convincing, all-encompassing knockout blow to American forces. They wanted to sap the American will to fight. In other words, bleed America into surrendering. Make the cost of fighting the war so expensive, the Americans would simply get up and walk away. Sound familiar? Let's take a moment and look at this.
President had hoped the Filipinos would willingly become part of the new American empire. The Filipinos were ready to die for the right to govern themselves. For years, they had fought the Spanish. Now they were prepared to fight the Americans, if they had to. In January 1899, they established the Philippine Republic. By 1900, Americans were fighting a guerrilla war 7,000 miles from home.
For the United States to maintain this empire, what the United States had to do was to use force and to project that force across thousands and thousands of miles. We had never done that. And we were now involved in civilizations, such as the Philippines, with which we had very little acquaintance. And it was a question whether or not Americans were really that good an imperialist in order to pull this off. This was an extremely brutal war that the United States and the Filipinos fought. Americans looked down on the Filipinos as people who were uncivilized. The term gook originated in the Philippine Insurrection. We looked at this as essentially a superior power fighting an inferior people who deserved their inferiority because they had not been able to organize their society. They had not been able to uplift themselves, as McKinley liked to say. The United States was willing to use very brutal force in order to bring the Filipinos around. One soldier's letter, for example, relates how one of his comrades, an American soldier, had been found murdered outside this village with his stomach slit open. And the American commander immediately orders that everyone in this Filipino village be executed. And according to this young man who wrote home, there were 1,000 men, women, and children who were executed in this reprisal for the murder of this one American soldier. This was a no-holds-barred war between the Filipinos and the Americans. And by 1900, many Americans are beginning to wonder whether even all of the possible profits that this empire might offer were worth this kind of brutality.
As more and more American boys lost their lives, anti-war sentiment was growing. Many saw the war against a people seeking independence as a monstrous perversion of American ideals. Multi-millionaire industrialist Andrew Carnegie, a leader of a small but important anti-imperialist movement, asked, "Is it possible that the American Republic is to be the suppressor of the Philippines' struggle for independence?" Carnegie offered to buy the Philippines for $20 million and set the island nation free. All through the winter of 1900, Americans read of devastation and horror half a globe away. Time and again, they were assured that the war was all but over. But native spies reported that thousands of Philippine insurgents were plotting to rise up against American forces in Manila. That a stash of bombs and munitions were hidden in a house in the center of that city. That rebels were massing in the provinces. McKinley had been told by his generals that they could subdue their barefoot opponents with 20,000 men. And the generals asked the president for 20,000 more. But 40,000 soldiers were not enough. By 1900, 60,000 American troops were on the ground in the Philippines. And the War Department was calling for another 2 divisions. McKinley knew that his chances in the November election could hinge on a war he didn't want to fight and didn't know how to win.
I don't know how you all feel about that video clip, but I'm gonna tell you, every time I see it, it sounds starkly familiar, very starkly familiar to another Asian war that we got involved in. By the way, the person, if you're taking notes, the person who was narrating was a man named Walter Lefebvre. He's a professor emeritus at University of California. He wrote a book entitled Inevitable Revolutions. His last name is spelled capital L-A-F-E-B-E-R, Walter Lefebvre. And he still is one of the top foreign policy historians in the United States. But notice what he said about the Philippine-American War, that the term gook, the same derogative term that we use on the Vietnamese, that's where they started using that term in Asia, gook. That McKinley thought that the Filipino people deserved their inferiority. The brutality exacted upon this one village, an entire village burned for the killing of one American soldier. I am not making light of the killing of one American soldier, but again, this just goes to show the dynamic of how little Filipino life meant compared to one American life. And then the fact that by 1900, this has been going on for about 2 years, a year and a half, that there was growing anti-war sentiment in the United States regarding the Philippine Insurrection or the Philippine-American War. People were having doubts and misgivings. Andrew Carnegie, one of the most hard-nosed, tough, business-minded people of the early 20th century, he's one of the people that Matthew Josephson wrote about in his book, Robber Barons. Okay, these were not squeamish men. These were not small individuals. They were tough. They were self-made. They called themselves captains of industry at a time when industry was grinding immigrants underfoot in brutal exploitation in the United States. Carnegie felt so bad about that, he offers to buy the island. And then consider the linkage of the Philippine-American War to a coming election. Of course, war and politics. Well, look. Let me just get to this point. The war ended, of course, badly for the Filipinos. And by 1902, there were over 126,000 American soldiers there. On July 4th, 1902, the US proclaimed that the insurrection was over with. So, okay, we won. Secretary of War Elihu Root said, "It is evident that the insurrection has been brought to an end both by making a war distressing and hopeless on the one hand, and by making peace attractive. By making a war distressing and hopeless on the one hand, and by making peace attractive on the other." Consequences. Well, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. America, as a result of the Philippine-American War and the Spanish-American War, got an overseas empire just like it wanted. In other words, it joined the colonizer club. But that came with some future implications, because while we were expanding into the Pacific, so was Japan. And that would produce some brutal consequences in 1941. The relationship with the Filipino people, American paternalism, American patriarchy, would not be forgotten for decades. And indeed, Duterte and the Filipino people have not forgotten it. And third, the relationship of the Filipinos and their relationship with colonialism and the history of colonialism has also been part of the brawl or the fight that's been going on even right now, especially the current administration with China, which experienced its own long period of foreign domination. And the Chinese people, so much of their politics, even under the communists, is guided by that memory of colonization, being dominated by foreign powers from the West. The Filipino people and the Chinese people, who, as the video pointed out, have been getting closer together. Just like MacArthur said, the Asian people are seeking to chart their own destiny. And frankly, they don't need the United States. The Philippines needs the United States, but Duterte has made it very, very plain that if America doesn't play according to the tune he's playing, if America doesn't dance to that tune, he's got an alternative in China and we shall see what happens. I will now take your questions.
Fred, thank you so much. It looks like we have about 15 minutes left. I'm looking in the chat, and actually we have quite a subdued group today. I did have one comment from someone in the chat. There was a reminder to everyone on this class, everyone in our country who has served, that it is Veterans Day and that we want to thank you, Fred, and all the other veterans in this class and in our country who have sacrificed so much, including some people have sacrificed their life in order to protect our democracy. And so
Very
we
well
can
said.
just offer
Very well said.
our
A special shout out to our Korean and Vietnam War veterans, our Iraq, anybody from Gulf War, our veterans in total. We are not suckers or losers.
Indeed. So yeah, I don't see anything in the chat right now. Actually, here's one that's just come in. How does Duterte's government compare to Marcos? I'm sorry, couldn't see that very well.
Well, you know, Ferdinand Marcos was, you know, in many ways, Filipino presidents have been democratically elected, but don't forget what the video said about entrenched elites. When you have entrenched elites, you can have elections going on, but it can be very much like, let's say, for example, what's happening in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin became president, but the oligarchs, those who were in Russia, to use an American metaphor, it was like the Wild West. And those who had the vision and the ruthlessness and were willing to do anything, irrespective of laws, written or not written, to seize assets, create wealth, generate wealth for themselves, they eventually assumed the levers of power. Now, what happened in Russia was that, of course, they never saw Vladimir Putin coming. The rule in the Philippines under Marcos was very similar to that, aligned with the very wealthy, as the video pointed out, the entrenched elites. And sure, they will hold elections and it gives the appearance of democracy, but what's actually happening under Marcos is that you have power every now and then that's being handed off from one crony to another crony, and the people are losing every time. This is why a guy like Duterte comes to power. He says the Filipino version of saying, he gives the Filipino version of, give me a chance. What the hell do you have to lose? And people say, right, because under democracy, as it's been running, they've been losing everything on a regular basis. And more than that, Susan, what they really like is that here's this guy, Duterte, who thumbs his nose at the elite establishment, because the people every day, they know they don't have the power to do that. But he's got the power to do that, and he starts saying everything that they've been feeling. He expresses all their outrage that they've been feeling. I mean, it all comes pouring out, and they give him the room to do what he does. What they don't realize is that, and I had it jotted down here, that's the same kind of thing that happened in Weimar, Germany. It happened very recently in France when Marine Le Pen was running with that far right party. She almost won those elections a few years ago. It happened in post-Soviet Russia, as I mentioned. And you know, we're living in, it's not the first time it's happened, and it may not be the last time, but we are definitely living in a season where right-wing or authoritarian rulers around the world have gotten the attention. Democracies have got to do a lot better at delivering what people need. I call it the politics, or not me, but one of my African colleagues in Kenya said, Johnson, it's the politics of the stomach. If you have a government that's democratic, but it can't keep the lights on, it can't protect people, it can't provide education, it can't provide utilities, but then someone comes along and says, hey, give me a shot. I can protect you. I can provide education. I can provide medical services. Think Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is an authoritarian military organization run by Iran, an Islamic, but not even a theological, but an Islamic tyranny state. But Hezbollah has a lot of support in Lebanon because it keeps the lights on, it protects people, it provides education. Is it a terrorist organization? You better believe it's a terrorist organization. Well, then why do people tolerate? Because when they're hungry, they get fed. The politics of the stomach.
Thank you for that. Another question came into the chat. What will happen to commerce should the South China Sea become a Chinese enclave with the support of the Philippines?
Well, it's going to be very interesting because first of all, what's going to happen with commerce? I suspect it's going to set up initially greater opportunities, just possibly greater opportunities for conflict between the United States and China, because China is definitely expanding its global reach around the world. They have a blue water navy, meaning a deep ocean navy that can extend. I love to talk about the United States Navy. That when I was in the Marine Corps, we always heard this thing about the U.S. Navy was that branch of the military. The Air Force does this too, but the ability to project force abroad. I almost punched my computer screen. To project force abroad. The Chinese now have that ability. Their Navy can compete with ours. With more commerce and more Chinese influence in the South China Sea, those are important sea lanes that go through Micronesia, Indonesia. I think the Moluccan Straits are nearby. So those are mineral rich, those are mineral rich areas. They are very heavily traveled sea lanes. And the mere presence of more Chinese ships and more American ships out there means there's an increased likelihood for greater confrontation. It may be friendly or it may be hostile, but the United States generally has assumed the posture, certainly in the last 4 years, that the Chinese are trade competitors and we are kind of schizophrenic or dual personality on whether or not they're actual military enemies as opposed to being just trade rivals.
Thank you for that. I don't see any additional questions in the chat. So if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question verbally, that would be great.
I have a question that came in to me, Susan, asking if Fred could share any of his growing up experiences there and whether he attended military schools or something else.
I have two wonderful memories of the Philippines. I mean, I have a lot of wonderful memories of the Philippines. I was there from the age of like 2 until 9 or 10. And I remember in the Philippines, I was taking judo classes. And my mother told me that the judo classes were like a mile away from the house. As a 5-year-old kid, I was walking to judo class a mile from my house. And my mother didn't worry about me. I don't know if she thought, I don't know if she was hoping I would get lost, but she didn't worry about me. She never came looking for me because it was a wonderfully safe environment. I remember coming out of the front door, there were a water buffalo in a rice paddy right across the street from the house. Filipino sunrises. I remember going to Baguio City in the Highlands with my father. He sang with a group of people called the Clark Men of Note. And it was a singing group, which was really good because my father could not sing, so I think they drowned him out. And there was that. And also, I remember I went to school on the Air Force. We lived off base, but I went to school on the Air Force base. And, it was just a very memorable time. It shaped so much of what I do now as far as loving history and wanted to go into military history because it was a throughway for American servicemen and women on their way to Vietnam and an exit way for American servicemen and women coming from Vietnam back to what they called the world. So there I was as a kid referring to the continental United States as the world because Vietnam veterans, people coming from Vietnam, refer to America as the world. And indeed, if you spent any time in Vietnam at all during the war, America was the world, a completely different world. So that I just remember the safety, but most of all, Kim, the thing that was most memorable about the Philippines was that because everybody on the island predominantly was brown, I had absolutely no idea of race differences, racism, none. But when my father transferred from the Philippines back to Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, Maryland is not the deep South like Georgia, Mississippi, but it's the South. And I mean, within days of being in Maryland, I started asking questions like, what is going on? Why are people acting like this? My parents did their best to shield me from the hard news, but you can't, as a child in America at that time period, not know that something is desperately wrong. I never had that feeling in the Philippines that I was somehow different and therefore was paying a societal price for that. That's the one thing that I do recall, the freedom of existence in that environment.
What a treasured memory indeed. Thank you. Anybody else?
Please, somebody ask something, because if you all don't, that means I gotta go talk to the students. I don't wanna do that.
That's right. Is it the last week of classes?
No, I think it's next week.
Next week. Okay.
No, we had, look, you guys don't like to joke. We have great students. Most of them are, yes.
Yeah, Kim, I have a question. I read a book years ago by Barbara Tuchman on the history of the Philippines and the Spanish-American War.
Yes.
Do you know the title of that book?
No, I do not, but I do know the name of Barbara Tuck. Hold on a second. Let me see. Let me get out of this real quick. I'll find it for you.
I have it on my bookshelf at home, but I can't remember the name of it.
Aren't you at home?
Let's see.
While he's looking for that, Donna, did you have a question?
Yes, I attended the City Hall program that brought in videos similar to this, but it was the one on the Philippines that happened to be narrated by an NPR journalist assigned to the eastern part of the world, the Far East. And she left us with the impression that Duterte was more than evil at this point. So Fred's background and history has skewed my understanding. And I've been to the Philippines. I didn't live there, but after Gary was in the military, we toured the Philippines as civilians. And I loved it there at that time. But then, of course, when the Marcos debacle happened and that governing body made international news, I thought, wow, it's good we're not there now. And then, of course, they bring all the bases to a halt after a volcano erupts. I thought that had something to do with it, but I'm not sure. I have mixed feelings, Fred. I don't know if I am cheering for Duterte or if I am not.
Well, I'll tell you, what I'm cheering for is democracy. And Duterte is one of those kind of leaders. It seems to me that I'll just speak for myself. It seems to me that what he's doing is working for the moment. Again, politics of the stomach. People are hungry right now, so he feeds them. But there's always the next meal, right? It doesn't matter if you're eating right now, unless you have a system and a leader and a government that can guarantee you the next meal, or at least can provide you with the possibility of getting the next meal. He's meeting an immediate need. Look, that stuff about the drug dealing and the crime in the Philippines, that's no small thing. When people are afraid, they're afraid. He shows up as the gunslinger, cleans up the town. But like those old West stories go, there's what's that one very famous movie, I can't think of it, but where I think it was, it shows the guy that arrives in town, Henry Fonda. He arrives in town as the gunslinging sheriff. He cleans up the town, and then he ends up becoming the tyrant of the town. So sometimes the solution is not the solution; it is just the beginning of the problem. Now, I
know.
That's the dilemma that we're in right now, right? Because people are frustrated. They are, I don't know if you guys that I did the one about the mine wars of the early 1920s. If you look at the state of West Virginia, there is no way that the state of West Virginia should have its voting pattern the way it is right now. That's because the Democratic Party failed them miserably. And when people do not have an alternative, when people who are everyday working people don't have an alternative and they lose faith in the leadership and they lose faith in the government to provide for their basic needs, they will look elsewhere. Like people in a government or in a society do, and they should, because government means something. And sometimes we have a guy like Duterte, he is different enough. You know, the video kept on talking about he's flouting democratic principles. Well, that may be true, but obviously those democratic principles were not working. And people will take a chance on results that are less than democratic than the certainty of democracy, which fails on a regular basis. This is our dilemma. This is why I tell students that if you're complaining about the democracy, don't tell me about it, go get involved, right? I know people thought that it was crazy for me to run for Congress. Of course it was crazy, but I was upset about things enough to where I said, I can sit up here and yell at my dog who doesn't care or go do something. And now I tell my students the same thing. The people in the Philippines have got it, and you see he's getting some pushback. The only question is whether or not the genie is now been let out of the bottle and you can put it back in there. He's definitely gravitated toward China, and America has a lot of work to do in catching up with the Philippines and also the African continent. I would encourage you all to take a look at the very heavy footprint that the Chinese have on the African continent, because even the North Koreans are getting involved in the African continent. And America has a very sad history of being involved in Africa only for resource exploitation, human and or otherwise. And it's one of the largest growing continents as far as its population. It's got one of the youngest populations overall in the world. And people say that by the middle or the late 21st century, Africa is going to be a continent on the move. If we're not there to have a seat at the table, guess what? We'll be standing outside the door listening to what's going on instead of being a part of the conversation. By the way, that book by Barbara W. Tuchman was entitled A Distant Mirror.
Thank you for that. It is 11:02. Does anybody have any final comments or questions where we can save Fred from moving on to his next venture?
Well, thank you very much, Fred, for your
we appreciate
presentation this morning.
You're welcome. I thank you all for giving me a chance to stroll down memory lane in the Philippines. I've had that back in years. I got to make that a trip.
We appreciate your contribution so much.
Sure. As always, I miss you guys. Truly looking forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, Fred.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you once again.
Certainly. Take care.
Fred, is there anything further that that we need to talk about before I close the class?
Not that I can think of, Susan. Kim and I already went over scheduling, so that should be done.
Great.
Kim, is there anything else?
I think she jumped off right at 11. I think she had another meeting.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the coordination, Susan. I'll talk to you guys.
Absolutely. Okay. Bye, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and end the class.
Okay, bye.
Have a great day.